and this blend between modern astrophysics, the space industry, astrotourism, and First Nations communities. So we're going to begin with Dr. Hilding Neilson from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, coming to talk about indigenizing the Drake equation. You're tall enough, I'm going to point that up.
A little higher. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming back after lunch and bearing with me as you have a food coma, probably. It was a great honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be on the land of these First Peoples and to honor them. And I want to thank the elders, the knowledge keepers, the new friends and old friends who I've learned so much from so far in my visit here. It has been truly wonderful. So today I want to talk about this idea of indigenizing the Drake equation. But in doing so, I want to sort of position myself first. I come from pretty far away. It's only a 30-hour travel time for me. I live on the eastern tip of that map in Newfoundland. And in Canada, like Australia, is all Indigenous land. Whether it is Mi'kmaq on the east coast or Salish on the west coast, every part of what we call Canada is Indigenous. And a lot of what I'll talk about is building on Indigenous methodologies from those lands. And as such, as we need to recall, Indigenous peoples have been on those lands since time immemorial, as they have been on these lands since time immemorial. Building, learning, creating an astronomy that is rich in tradition and knowledges that is an important part of how we live. But I'm kind of jumping through this. Usually when I give this talk, I try to scaffold and build it up, but I'm just going to jump straight to the good parts. So this idea is thinking about how we use Indigenous knowledges. And I like kind of thinking about this as an idea of axioms, mostly because I work around particle physicists, and throwing an X and an M in there, it kind of messes with them a little bit. But this is kind of building on the works of people like Daniel Laipe, Marie Batiste, Gregory Cajete, and thinking about those ideas. You know, when we've heard so far in this conference, concepts around what is above is reflected below. Whether it is the sky, stars are maps of the land or ways of being, it is a reflection of where we are. For many people, knowledge is relational. That might sound kind of funny as a Western scientist to say something like that, where in Western science we teach that knowledge is objective. You earn it, you hoard it, you do experiments, you write papers, you win Nobel Prizes, and you own it. But for many Indigenous folk, knowledge is relational. It's how you use it. It's who benefits, who serves with that knowledge. One of my favorite kind of concepts is this idea of multiple variables acting concurrently. In one story, near where I live, the Innu hunt caribou. For those who don't know, caribou are wild reindeer. We don't have domesticated reindeer in North America, we have caribou. And the caribou migrate over hundreds of kilometers every year in different directions, in different ways, and every migration path is different. So if you're a Western scientist, it is very hard to track that. But the elders, the knowledge keepers, they intuitively know how the migration works. And not only that, they'll do something very simple like move a few stones, you know, kick a bit of dirt around, and they'll manipulate the migration path to benefit the hunt and to support them. So that's bringing all those multiple variables together in one concurrent sense, as opposed to Western science. You know, when I teach first year physics, I'll drop a ball and you measure the acceleration of gravity. And we'll take the ball and drop it from another height. You got to measure the acceleration again, and another height. And you're just trying to break everything down into the smallest constituent variables. Knowledge is also holistic. Now, I don't really think I need to say that here, but I work in a physics department that's across the street from a chemistry department that's down the road from engineering. I don't even know where the English department is at my university. Probably a bad thing to say. But yeah, we're all in our own silos, our own disciplines. But that's not really how many Indigenous peoples think. You know, the stories of our stars are stories of how we live on land, how we operate in connection with nature and animals and plants, not just the stars themselves. I think most importantly for this talk is the concept of nature being familial. In Mi'kmaq, we talk about treaty a lot, not just treaty with the crown or nation and nation treaty, but treaty with the salmon, the bear, the water. And those treaties are not just rights, they're responsibilities. They're how we live as equal partners with those beings, whether it is plant beings, whether it is animal beings, whether it is sky beings. And that's part of what it means in that sense. It's a thing of nature as a familial sense, not a hierarchy. We're not above the bear. We're not above the salmon. But I want to also reiterate very strongly, there's no such thing as a pan-indigenous knowledge system. Every nation, every people have their own perspectives and views. And what I'm hoping this kind of collation of information from various scholars is not to say that there's a pan-indigenous knowledge system, but we all have our knowledge systems, and sometimes they rhyme, they're related. And so maybe those commonalities are a way we can sort of approach our view of science and understanding the universe. And we can compare them then with what I like to call traditional Western science. Coming from North America, they keep saying traditional knowledges for indigenous people. It sounds weird, so I just put it back to them and say traditional Western science. Knowledge is an objective thing. It's rational, it's universal. If I do an experiment, you should be able to repeat the experiment. You should be able to repeat the experiment. You should get the same result. Working in the smallest number of variables, working in disciplines, and of course, working in a hierarchy with nature. Now, having said that, what does that mean for the question of life in the universe? It's not a small question, but maybe we can, solve everything in a half hour or 10 minutes, or till Dwayne kicks me off the stage. What does it mean for that? And so one of the ways this has been approached goes back to the 1950s and 60s with the astronomer Frank Drake. Kind of an important person in the context of some of this conference, because Frank Drake was a radio astronomer in the US who wanted to look for radio signals from other worlds. We heard yesterday in the SKA panel, one of the astronomers said that SKA may be used to search for life in the universe through this kind of methodology. But in that way, what you're looking for is, whether radio signals being leaked out in space by other civilization, similar in the same way we're kind of dealing with the lack of dark and quiet skies. So also feeding into some of the issues from this morning. But this question or experiment is, he thought about it in terms of an equation. And that's not really a mathematical equation. It's more like one of those nesting dolls, or like you're going to sort rocks by size. And in that equation, Frank Drake said, if n is the number of, I'm going to be using air quotes a lot, so please excuse me if I don't, the number of civilizations that are out in the galaxy is a function of things that we need to understand. The first term, that R star, is the number of stars born every year. Well, astronomy and astrophysics have a good estimate of that. We think about 3 suns worth of stars are born every year, give or take. The next term is, okay, of all those stars born, how many of those stars will have planets? Thanks to missions like Kepler, the TESS, lots of astronomy in the last 20 years, we know that about 1 in every 5 stars have planets. So that's a good sign. We know that. The next term, little n, is, well, if you have a solar system, how many planets on average are in that solar system? Depending on your perspective, our solar system has 8 or 9. It's a question of what you feel about Pluto. And so other planetary system, TRAPPIST, is about 5, which you may have heard of, but some all seem to have 1. Then after that, we get into the nitty-gritty. After we figure out the number of planets, well, what is the fraction of those planets that could go on to support life? So if you have 100 planets, do they all have the conditions that might support life? Then after that is the fraction of planets that the fraction of planets that can support life, what fraction of them will go on to support intelligent life? Big quotes, intelligent life. Very problematic. And beyond that, if you talk about intelligent life, what fraction of those with intelligent life will have civilizations that will produce a technology that is detectable from space? And then the final term, that big L, which is the length of time that such civilizations will release detectable signals. And so Drake was sort of breaking all this apart to sort of have a sense of, when you look in the night sky, when you see all the stars, how many of them might have a detectable signal of some sort of advanced alien life. And from his perspective, it was only a handful possible options. because the idea is, the idea of technology, lifetimes are so hard. And we'll get into some of that and break it down even more. Particularly, I'm going to kind of skip the idea of the star formation rate and the fraction of planets and the number of planets in the solar system. Although I should note that is a bias. Frank Drake was assuming, and astronomers today assume, that life is born only on planets. There's no reason that it has to be true. We know it's a lot easier because we live on a planet, but it doesn't have to be true. But we'll talk about these concepts about what does it mean to be life? What does it mean to be intelligent life? What does it mean to be civilization and technology? And these are all problematic because they're all coming from a very specific lens. That lens is, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s US, which thank God it's not this US today, but that US was also not the ideal. So how do we define these things? Well, when Drake was doing this work, he thought of intelligent life as civilization. I keep using these air quotes, as essentially being the Western typical techno society. Cities, rockets, internet, and so on. Or radio signals, or TV signals. And in that sense, if that is the intelligent life, then we have a very good sense of all the things to go with it. But what if we think about it through those indigenous methods? So let's break down the idea of intelligent life. Now, Professor Holbrook has a poster that talks about how racist the idea of intelligent life has been in science. It's absolutely a horrible definition, but it goes worse than that. This image is called the tree of life in biology. And so the idea is every kind of spoke is a different species, and the one line in the bottom is a reference to the last common ancestor of all those species on Earth. Somewhere near the top there in the middle is where humans are. Right next to them would be primates and other mammals, bacteria on one side, fungi on the other. And in all those different species or properties of life, we only consider humans intelligent in this option. And that's strange. Why should humans only be intelligent? From a Mi'kmaq perspective, from many indigenous perspectives, life is intelligent. Plants have their own ways of being. Salmon have their own ways of being that is intelligent. Only last year, killer whales were observed to ram yachts. They know that billionaires aren't necessary. We're not that smart. Cats ignore us, avoid us, eat our food, and tell us what to do. While we go out, work, and pay taxes. Who's more intelligent? The idea of intelligence can be very problematic, not just from a sense of race science, but animalistic, but just in this sense. So I'm going to suggest from an indigenous perspective, the idea of intelligent life, or the fraction of planets of intelligent life, is a moot point. All life is intelligent, whether it is humans or the single cell being that hasn't needed to evolve in 5 billion years. Then we can ask this question, well, how long do the civilizations last and emit detectable signals? That big bell. Now I'm going to be flipping that around in this meeting many ways, because it's not just about detectability of them, it's also our ability to observe, as well as our ability to survive. Now, when Frank Drake was working on this, the biggest issue they were facing in the United States was the nuclear scare. And so he argued that probably the thing that would limit the detectability of a society is nuclear war. Of course, I'm sure he was ignoring the fact that we were testing nuclear weapons on peoples in Marshall Islands and in Australia, and as such, we were destroying peoples then as well. But in that respect, he kind of guessed maybe the lifetime would be 50 years or a century. On the right, you can't really see it. This is a sign in Nova Scotia from when Canada was celebrating its 150th anniversary as a country, which was about a decade ago. And on that sign, it says Canada 150, Mi'kmaq 13,000. The Mi'kmaq people were there for 13,000 years. That civilization was there for 13,000 years. I'm also ignoring the fact that the 13,000 is a really bad anthropological number that Western people decided was the right number because it was impossible to believe in time immemorial. But let's say we're at least 13,000 years Mi'kmaq. we keep hearing on this conference at least 60, 70,000 years in Australia. And so that civilization's living not just 50 years, 100 years, but tens of thousands of years at least. And I'm ignoring the whole time immemorial part because that's just too uncomfortable for many people. So just bringing those two things together, does that, what we call the life, intelligent life, and what we call civilization, does that change the number of advanced civilizations in our galaxy? So that, what Drake was doing this, he said the fraction of planets that have intelligent life, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million. Likewise, the fraction with civilizations, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million. And we have no more information about that today than we did in Frank Drake's time, largely because all we're doing is looking at ourselves. And I would argue that part of that is also thinking about how we define a civilization. This is the only talk I have ever done this where I use a definition from a dictionary. Webster's dictionary defines civilization as the stage of social and cultural development and recognition that is considered the most advanced. Now, I'm not sure if that makes sense. Doesn't make sense to me because it sounds like a civilization is defined as itself. It doesn't mean anything. But we are civilizations under that definition as Indigenous folk, whether there's Mi'kmaq here, New Zealand, wherever. And it's not the issue of being the most advanced, being most adapted perhaps as well. It wasn't because when the first people, settlers, colonizers came to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, the Eastern Canada, they were not more advanced by any definition. They were pretty much unadvanced, and many of them were adopted into Indigenous communities because they had a better chance of survival. So the technology issue is very challenging. So bringing all that together, in this kind of convoluted way that I'm speaking, it would suggest to me that if we think about this Drake equation from an Indigenous lens, Indigenous methodologies, then the galaxy must be teeming with much more life than Frank Drake would have ever thought. From a Western perspective, the Drake equation suggests that life and intelligent life and civilization, whatever you want to call them, are intensely rare. But from this Indigenous perspective, it is all alive. I'm not even just talking about the inanimate versus animate issues, whether we have a whole conversation about whether a planet or a moon is alive. But it's just a life as in the simple case that we define it through a Western lens, through the individual, through the cell, would be very different. And that's very important because that should influence how astronomers want to do things like search for life. Because right now we're really just trying to do two things. We're trying to find the bacteria on other worlds. Every once in a while you'll see a little V kind of dip that's somehow evidence of life that doesn't actually tell you anything. Or we want to find things like technosignatures, signs of advanced technologies, like what the SKA might do. And in that terms of technosignatures, they usually come in two flavors. Technosignatures are either things we hypothesize as a reflection of things on Earth, like nuclear power, like climate change, like 2 minutes left, or things that we think about our future impact, like science fiction, which is, in this case, a Dyson sphere. The idea that we want to be so extractive, we're going to take all the light from the sun and harness it in a shell. Current searches include, radio, searching for light pollution. The idea of our Alan, as we've heard this morning, wasting so much light as garbage is a detectable form of searching for quote unquote intelligent life. Or the more fantastic, which is searching for Dyson spheres, which are these shells that are built around stars, or searching for lasers. And I don't know who came up with it, but I can't say it without hearing Dr. Evil in my head. And in this case, the idea of lasers, if you have solar sails, they reflect, you use lasers to propel them and they reflect light, and we maybe detect the reflected laser light. We call it what we call optical SETI. So if they're out there, can we see them? Now, this is a quick toy model, a plot about this, because when we talk about Drake equation in a Western perspective, we're thinking about advanced technology, but we're not looking for advanced technology. When we're looking for light pollution or lasers or Dyson, what we're looking for is impact, deviations from nature. And so let's break it. Instead of saying advanced, we'll just say technological impact on the y-axis, technological advancement by whatever definition on the x. And let's say we're the diagonal line, that Western civilization line. And so anything above a certain level is currently detected. But it's not because of how advanced they are, it's by how much damage they're doing to their environment that is visible to us. But in that respect, that means there could be a whole swath of beings in our galaxy that have way more advanced technology than us by whatever definition of technology and aren't detectable because they don't impact their environment in the same way, that they live in a way that is beneficial or supportive of their environment. So we can't distinguish it with our current radio or James Webb Space Telescopes, etc. On the other hand, what would a society in the universe say if they saw us? Because let's say we're hanging out on this line. It's very possible we're above the line for some very advanced civilizations or societies who have the technology to detect this. What would they see? Would they see the colonialism? Would they see the pollution, the damage? And so this kind of answers a different question, the Fermi paradox. Enrico Fermi asked this question. We know our solar system is like 4.5 billion years old. Our galaxy is 10 billion years. That means there's like a 5 billion year window where civilizations could have evolved, advanced, went through the galaxy, did whatever they want. So if that's the case, why aren't we living in this kind of Star Trek universe where there's aliens everywhere? Why haven't we seen them? And if they could detect us or detect what we are like today, I would kind of postulate one of the resolutions, and there's like hundreds of resolutions to the Fermi paradox, is that we're gross. Our pollution, our colonialism, our neglect, why would they want to interact with us? Why would they want to? We would probably just be a pain in their neck asking them for help. So that, I think, is another kind of resolution we see bringing these together. So I'll just put up my conclusions here, and I'm not really sure why that small bullet is on the bottom, but indigenous perspectives are important in astronomy. They enrich our view of the universe. We learn from them. We need to go beyond simple Western astronomy methodologies and be more holistic because it gives us better ideas, different ways of being. In Mi'kmaq, we have a philosophy, two-eyed seeing. One lens with indigenous knowledge, one lens with Western science. And you have the two lenses gives you a deeper view. And so this impacts how we view the Drake equation and how we might think of what are advanced life civilizations and so on. But hopefully it can be reconstructed and reviewed, particularly if we're going to spend billions of dollars on telescopes around the world. With that, Walalia. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilding. I really don't want to stop. I'll keep talking. You actually have a really, really good delivery system and way of talking about things. I could have just gone all day long. We're a few minutes behind, but I can have a shorter tea time. One quick question.
Thank you. My question is, when you talk in your presentation about Western view of these things, really you are talking about natural science or astronomers, Western academic astronomers view, because many of the terms of the Drake equation are defined in a very natural science way without any kind of relation with the same situations in the social science. For example, when you talk about the number of planets, you go to astronomical sources, but when you talk about the definition of civilization, Western definition, you use the dictionary. But social science discusses a lot about what is a civilization, even in Western perspective. Maybe we need not only incorporate indigenous views, different local views, but also different science views to a more broad perspective, because detection of civilizations or other forms of intelligent life not only an astronomical problem, it's more holistic.
Yes, I agree with your sentiments. I was mostly speaking this from the astronomer perspective, or Freight Drake. And as I noted in the beginning, Western science tends to be very siloed. Like, I'm not sure my social sciences department are on my campus either. I've only been there for 3 years. That sounds really sad. But yes, talking with other scientists, humanities, arts is an important step to this, as well as incorporating and integrating, working with indigenous knowledges.
Sorry to jump in, but I had to do the Drake equation many, many years ago when I was doing my physics grad, and it felt really rigged. It felt like the answer was designed to be one, because that's the answer that if you actually solve it, it comes out as one, us. So it's a really egocentric view of the universe to say that we are the only intelligent life or civilization or however they want to define that. So it's kind of a rigged equation to begin with, let alone with any of the other variables that you have to take into account. So I think it's kind of yeah, like the equation kind of needs to be redone. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it's great to see these kinds of new approaches to these old problems that just sort of linger around forever. How can we think about them in radically different ways? Can we thank Professor? I think we get some of these really great talks. They can go for a few minutes. You know, it's fine. We'll do fine with tea. Dionysios Gakis, very excited for you to come up and talk to us a bit about Echoes of Star Stories.
So, hello everyone. I'm Dionysios Gakis. I'm a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, working on stellar and galactic astrophysics. And today I will talk to you about how we can integrate indigenous knowledge into modern science. So this talk is essentially a review and will have 2 parts. In the first part, I will show some examples on how informed indigenous people were in terms of stellar astrophysics and how this knowledge resonates with modern beliefs. I'm focusing on stellar astrophysics because that's my domain of research, but of course there are plenty of other examples in terms of other parts of astronomy like planets, aurora, eclipses. So if you know more examples, please come talk to me. I would be excited to know more. But as a heads up, I'm not focusing on the mythology. I'm just looking to see the connection of how the indigenous knowledge is connected to our modern beliefs. And in the second part, we will talk about how we can integrate this indigenous knowledge in research, education, and outreach. So the examples we will see come from categories of stellar astrophysics, and in particular transients, variable stars, nebulae, stellar evolution, and multiple star association. So to start on, stellar transients refer to the rapid change of a star brightness in a short period of time. And the most, let's say, important or the most violent categories are the novae, which refer to the explosion of a white dwarf of a binary system, and supernovae, the catastrophic death of a star. So both of them release immense amounts of light in a short period of time, and they're visible. They remain visible for days or for weeks, even months, and they leave remnants lasting for millennia. So Duane has some criteria in his paper about how whether we can confirm some indigenous tradition into an actual nova or supernova, and these criteria, namely, are that this tradition should specifically mention a new star appearance in the sky. Also, we need to know the location and the timings of those traditions. We need to know the sky location, and also the tradition should identify this as a star. So interestingly, we have one case that all of those criteria are fulfilled, and this is the case of Eta Carina. So astrophysically speaking, Eta Carina exploded in the 1840s. This is its light curve. It is a very important star, astrophysically speaking. and at the time, it became the second brightest star in the sky. And its remnant is still visible in Hubble Space Telescope images. So we indeed have let's say Aboriginal people of Burong people, Aboriginal people actually observed that, and they incorporate it in their tradition as the wife of Canopus. So nowadays it is actually confirmed, confidently confirmed, that they refer to this explosion of the star. For other cases, while we have several historical supernovae that have been confirmed from multiple cultures worldwide, it's more tough to do that for indigenous knowledge, and that's because of difficulties related to ambiguities in location, in also geographical and sky location, in timings, and also related to artistic interpretation. But we have some speculative but still interesting cases. For example, we have you see some examples here from traditions coming from indigenous people all the way from Australia to North and South America. For example, some of them refer to the well-known supernovae 1054, the Crab supernovae, or it is interesting that, for example, the indigenous people of Bolivia might also observe Eta Carina explosion, but this is still something not confirmed. So moving on, I think the case of Mahutonga is very interesting because it refers to the invisible southern star mentioned in the Maori tradition during their migration. And if it's true, it actually predates their arrival to New Zealand. So there's nothing confirmed yet about what it refers to. We have some ideas, but nothing definitive, because we also don't have information about like a supernova that we know that was visible in New Zealand during those times. But still, it is another interesting case that it's worth investigating. In general, there are some other categories of stars, the variable stars, that also change the brightness periodically or semi-periodically. And these are the examples of giant stars, Betelgeuse, Aldebaran, and Antares, that regulate their brightness within timescales of a few years. And also the amplitude of their brightness change is visible for experienced observers. And indeed, we find stories from Aboriginal people that we think that they could actually observe the variability of those stars. Indigenous people not only paid attention at stars, they also paid attention to regions of the sky that are dark, that light is absent there. And modern astrophysics says that several of those dark patches of the Milky Way are actually nebulae, where new stars are formed there, new stars are being born. So according to the location of different indigenous people, they saw in the sky shapes similar to the animals that they had around. For example, Aboriginal Australians saw animals like emu or kangaroos. Incas saw llamas, serpents, toads, foxes traveling across the river of the Milky Way. And we can also find many other examples. For example, Brazilians saw some form in the sky totally similar to what Aboriginal Australians saw, or the Maya described those dark regions as the Black Road. So the meaning here is that we know, or we can see that indigenous people knew about the different nature of these regions, and that's why they assigned to them different kind of stories compared to, let's say, stars. Oral stories of indigenous people refer to stars as human beings. So they are born, they live, and they die, which mirrors exactly the modern view of astrophysics about stellar evolution. So again, we have some examples here about how the indigenous people represent stellar evolution in their stories. For example, people in Australia saw some mystic representation of stellar relationships, or the Inuit and Incas people have stories about how stars are being born in those nebulae that we talked about. Next, the Incas also describe the imminent death of Antares. Maori people see stars as something not eternal, but rather as something that has a start and an end. And Pueblo peoples have metaphors about the cosmic order versus randomness in the star distribution in the sky. And also, as one might expect, indigenous people were drawn by stars appearing very close in the sky. And that's why they have several stories about them. One example is here from Aboriginal Australians. They have plenty of stories about stars appearing together. This is one of them with Alpha 1 and 2 Capricornus. Even though that modern measurements suggest that this is just a visual effect, so those stars are not really close, they just appear to be close. It's still interesting to see those stories in the traditions. Also, the case of Potolo story from the Dogon people of Mali is really interesting. So they refer to that star as a dense companion to the brightest star of the sky, Sirius. And the truth is that there is actually a star there, a white dwarf star that is very dense. It is very dim, and it was discovered with the aid of telescope in the 19th century. But exactly because of that, the dimness of the star challenges the hypothesis that the Dogon people of Mali actually knew about that. So it could be just a Western influence. And stellar clusters, which are the association of stars bound by gravity, also appear ubiquitously in oral traditions. We would say that the case of Pleiades is the most frequently found. Different people assign different stories and different names, and that makes sense because Pleiades is one of the most visible clusters in the sky, and they use this cluster for navigation purposes, also for timekeeping or seasonal cycles keep tracking. So moving on to the next, to the second part of our talk, integration, collaboration, public engagement. It is very critical that we incorporate indigenous knowledge in modern science, and in particular astrophysics. So they can enhance hypothesis generation and prompt very important and interesting science questions. For example, by integrating those empirical observations can enrich our dataset. For example, like in the case of Eta Carina that we just saw, but at least to the extent that we can trust those traditions for science and research. Also, it is critical to contribute to the historical sky reconstruction, and all this cross-matching between indigenous traditions and observations have given rise to the fields of ethnoastronomy and archaeoastronomy. Including indigenous knowledge can also be beneficial in classroom settings, in education, and in outreach. So they can engage the younger generation, both indigenous and non-indigenous young people, and give them perspective in order to combine science with different fields like history or environment. And it can also teach them that science is not one-sided. So some initiatives towards that direction are native astronomy camps in the US, in Australia, and also the inclusion of story-based planetarium shows worldwide. But also, I want to point out that it's very critical to challenge the myth that Western science is the only one that is dominant. And we should view science from all possible perspectives. And lastly, when we integrate indigenous knowledge, we should also be cautious and follow some guidelines like this. So we should respect the community ownership of them and also make sure to understand the context of them and not view them through the lens that we choose. Always we should give the proper attribution to both individuals and the communities and make sure that we have the proper consent. So some successful models include this two-eyed sync, which includes both the Western perspective on things and the indigenous perspective on things. And also another could be the ASCAP collaboration with indigenous people, with Aboriginal people that we saw yesterday. So I leave it here and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any online questions? Nobody online? Any in-person questions?
In Maori culture, for example, you use present tense language, like they see and they use, but I noticed that when I spoke to Australian First Nations people use past tense, like they use and they saw in your talk, and maybe it's just a minor thing, but I'm just wondering if there's a reason why maybe
yeah, there's not an actual reason. For example, the reason I used past tense for Aboriginal Australians was that Itakarina explosion that they observed. So that's a past thing, and that's why I used past tenses then. But in general, no, I would use present tenses in everything. So if I misuse some of the tenses, that's on me. It doesn't reflect anything.
Great, thanks. Great, thanks again. Great, so now we're going to have Auntie Kerri Douglas and Jamie Rooney come up and speak to us about co-design in First Nations Astrotourism. Yeah.
Hello. Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Dionysios. That is an amazing setup for our presentation here.
Definitely. I'd like to acknowledge the elders and the ancestors of the Wurundjeri people where I stand right now, so thank you. My name's Kerri Douglas. I'm a proud Dja Dja Wurrung and Bangarang woman from central Victoria and along the Murray region into New South Wales. I have taken on a role working at Tumo, which is Dja Dja Wurrung's arts, education and tourism precinct. And I've come from working 12 years in education prior to that.
Thanks, Kerri. I think everyone maybe knows me already. I'm the guy that's been showing everyone else off the stage, and now I get my chance to run over time and really annoy the organisers. There's a bit of a difference for me. I'm going to stand back for the vast majority of this talk and let Auntie Kerri deliver all of it, and I get a nice rest. What we are going to discuss today is a project we've been working on together for a while for an Astro tour on Dja Dja Wurrung country that has been completely led by and driven by Dja Dja Wurrung. So whilst we're discussing this, I would quite like everyone to consider a bit of a perspective shift, rather than this being a researcher-led project where I've come up, or an academic's come up with this great, amazing idea and lovely research questions. It's the other way around. Dja Dja Wurrung have come up with this idea of delivering a tour, and they've led it, and my only role here is assistance and support where needed. So at this point, I'll step back and let you go for it.
You're so underselling yourself. So as Jamie said, it is being Dja Dja Wurrung led. Our project is creating a sky country tour of Mount Kiora. We're going to talk about the co-design element of it, how we've approached it, where we're going next, and some of the learnings that we've come from around the whole project. So we have done a bit of an introduction. Jara itself is a large area of central Victoria. Back in 2013, Dja Dja Wurrung signed an agreement with the state government here of Victoria to basically recognise us as the traditional owners of a land which we call Jandak, which is Dja Dja Wurrung country. As part of that, we got roughly 2,500 square kilometres of land back to us. We don't own all of it, but we co-manage some of the area. One of those areas is a national park called Kiora State Park. As part of that, we do manage that particular area. We also started to run tours of that area. So where that little diamond is on the screen, it is about 2.5 hours drive from Melbourne. So please feel free to come and join us out on country. Next. So that little area is called Kiora, or as we know with colonisation, they start renaming things. So Mount Kiora. To us, Kiora is a mountain of light. The large granite outcrops on the area have a lot of quartz within that, and at times the mountain shines. So to us, it is a mountain of light. Renaming of the area was common practice to erase First Nations connections with the land, waterways, and of course, sky. Kiora was a place of gathering for many of our clans, but other Jara families and clans would gather at times of important ceremony. There are many sacred sites across that mountain. As part of that, we do not take any people to those sacred sites for the tours. The culturally significant spaces include artefacts such as stone napping sites, scar trees, ring trees, which are our signposts, man-made rock wells and bathing holes. But the mountain itself has a lot of water soak, so there was water all year round, regardless of the temperature. Now, I do want to point out the gorgeous Shani, which is down the front of our slideshow here. She is the main reason why we're actually here and talking about this. So Shani is our tour guide who does the mountain already. And as I said, I started working at Tumo 9 months ago, and Shani got really, really excited and said, have I got an idea for you? And it's kind of snowballed from there. So, yeah.
So these tours that are being delivered by Tumo are full cultural immersions. They're taking members of the public as well as First Nations people up onto the mountain, and they're sharing culture. This is always taking place during the day, where people get to go up, sit down on country, have a yarn. Sharni is incredibly passionate about astronomy and First Nations sky stories. So at her push, this sort of developed further into what can we start doing at night, which led to this very brief pathway that I might speak to quickly. So as noted, I've worked with Dja Dja Wurrung for the best part of 8 years or so now. Sharni and I have got a long-established relationship. We've been working quite closely for about 5 years. And this all started with her and I arguing over who was the better astrophotographer and who could take the best pictures. Then, like a couple of friends at midnight are just saying, oh, we should go out and buy a bar together. Sharni and I kept on saying, oh, we should totally start doing star tours together at Kiora. But it never actually came to anything until Auntie Kerri came along.
Thanks. A part of that was that coming from education, so many times I had schools approaching me saying, we'd love to do something around astronomy. We'd love to do something about the stars with Indigenous knowledge over that. So it kind of felt like an awesome blend to have the tours, to be able to utilise some of the knowledges, to be able to educate people left, right and centre. So as part of it, Shani suggested the introduction, did the introduction to Jamie and I. The tour is very, very Jara-led, which is a core element of who we are in self-determination. Self-determination is a strong focus for all of our product range by Jara for Jara. it also aligns with one of our country plans, which was an outcome of the agreement with the state government.
So what we might speak to then is the process of how we actually started to create this. As we said, it started out as a bit of a thought bubble that went absolutely nowhere until we got a driving force behind us that knocked our heads together and said, let's actually deliver something. So although I'd been working with Jajawarong for a really long time by this point, I hadn't quite worked with Auntie Kerri, although I had been working with your son for half a decade by that point. So we got together, we had our initial discussions and just a bit of a getting to know each other session. We met in Tumo's office. We won't talk about the first time that we met.
No.
And we just started discussing what we could possibly do and how to do it. So this led into a bit of a brain dumping exercise where the Jajawarong elders and members in the room gave us a lot of insight into their knowledge of Kiora, a lot of knowledge of the site and the centre and what was there. And I started to dump a lot of the astrophysics and a lot of that astronomical knowledge into the discussion as well. And as we progressed, this just began to layer where we had some astronomy, mixed in with some First Nations knowledge with some more astronomy. And we started to create and blend something completely new.
We literally had a whiteboard covered with all of these different ideas, Jamie's knowledge, our knowledge, what stories we actually wanted to be able to talk to when we were talking to the stars, and where it actually aligned with common knowledge from both sides. So being able to then take our huge, big ideas and bring them back to a smaller scale to go, have we got the tour guides who actually have the knowledge in the first place to be able to share these stories out on country? And what stories can we actually do that are not secret?
Which leads us up to that bottom centre point, which is the Wartika. A Wartika is...
to come with purpose. So it is a knowledge group where our elders will actually sit around the table and go, yes, you can say this, no, you can't. Here's a creation story that we're happy for you to. Here's a creation story that is actually aligned to the mountain that you're actually doing the tour on, not just random knowledge.
So we realised just as we were having a catch up outside 10 minutes ago that we should have had a few more arrows in this because this whole process is incredibly iterative. The reason that we had a brain dump before testing it with the elders is because we both felt it was really important to go to the elders with something rather than going and sitting into a room and saying, hey, tell us everything that you know, please, so we can deliver the tour, even one that is Jajawarong led. We wanted to go along with a basic outline of what we know or what we think we know, that they can then feed back to us and say, this is great, this isn't, keep this in, take this out. From that point, we'll then go and have a second Wartika after we test those ideas and make sure that it is in line with that understanding.
It was also good that Jamie had a bit of a light bulb moment where he's come with all of his knowledge and just gone, you know what, I can't. We need to put First Nations knowledge first, which was absolutely awesome because I thought my tour guides are never going to understand some of the information that Jamie's talking about.
Which was a big learning point for me. And this is when we would just go off script and start chatting, isn't it? I was going in as a Western scientist and I was thinking, science, this is what we have to focus on. And it was only after a few of these discussions where I realized that what we were delivering was story. Science is one small aspect of it, but what we're really focusing on is the delivery of the Jajawarong stories. And a really good illustration of this was in some of the Jajawarong languages, we seem to have two names for Bunjil. There was Bunjil and there was Wanjil. And there's two different stars, Bunjil being Altair, Wanjil being Sirius. And I must have spent a good 6 months trying to work out why there was these two different names. And I went through linguistic searches, I searched half a dozen databases, came up with nothing until we were sitting chatting and Kerri said.
Oh, I can't even remember what I said. It was so long ago.
Basically just referenced a children's story that pointed out that Bunjil is the creator deity that sits in the sky, and Wanjil is the eagle that is his representation on Earth. I got really deep into the science. I was studying a thesis of a Wargaya dictionary from like the 1800s, rather than just go and speaking to the elder and realizing that what I was actually trying to find out, the answer is in every single storybook for kids on Jajawarong country. So I had to pull myself back as a scientist, as an astronomer, and just think of the story because that was the really important part.
So yeah, now we're sort of putting it all together. Again, we've put out the expression of interest for some of the elders to come and talk to us about the Wataka so that they can actually share our knowledge. After going into the planetarium and having a session, we kind of went, let's just focus on 4 particular stories to be able to share our knowledge with people so that they can see both perspectives as what that actually means. So yeah.
So before we jump onto the actual learnings and our takeaways, as this program's been developing, it's developed really organically. And one of the great outcomes of it happened about 15 minutes ago, where Dan Peluso, who's here representing SETI, sat down with Leanne, who's taking photos of us in the back, and Auntie Kerri, and agreed, possibly in principle, to give them one of these new fantastic unistellar telescopes. So the Jaja Wurrung can take that home with them tonight and start using this telescope to further their own knowledge of the stars and use that on country to educate their other people. We've also decided, about 2 days ago, that we're going to try and have this whole thing registered as intangible cultural heritage. I can see the other heritage advisor here going, oh, good luck. In Victoria, we have a provision that allows us to register intangible heritage on a state government-run and operated website that will convey IPIC, essentially copyrights, ensuring that these stories are going to become Jaja Wurrung stories forever legally. So if Dwayne and I at one point decide we want to write a book on these stories, we have to go straight back to Tumo, get their permission, pay them royalties. These stories will be theirs. That's also going to lead into a wider tangible protection of Kiora to ensure that it will be protected moving forward. And I will be speaking to the dark sky people a bit later on as well about how we can start moving into protecting this as a dark sky site moving forward.
It just keeps snowballing.
We now have 2 minutes. So our learnings, for me, the really big thing is time and flexibility. When I started out on this process, my PhD research was going to be in First Nations agriculture as it related to the stars. I realised after quite early discussions that none of the traditional ones I was working with had any interest in that. What they were really keen on was astrotourism. And
yeah, it's just kind of progressed, and our train line has literally moved and jagged and all over the place. But what Jamie has probably sold himself short on is that he has taken 8 years to actually form the relationship with us to be able to have those conversations with us and develop this product. We're really, really proud of everything that Jamie is doing to work with us, and that sometimes our timelines are going to go out the window because of what is actually happening in community. He understands that sometimes our community shut down for certain reasons, and that timelines do go out the window. When we first had the conversations, we were hoping that we would have had the tour up and running by now. And of course, community gets in the way and things happen and timelines have changed. But he has taken the time to build relationships with us, to have open and honest conversations with us that we can just go, no, Jamie, it's not going to work that way, or we need to back off a little bit. He also understands that if the elders go, secret, sacred, you need to bugger off out of the room while we have this conversation, he's happy to do that too, which is absolutely fantastic.
So what, because I'm scared of you?
Don't be scared of me, mate. There's worse elders out there.
So yeah, that comes down to that bottom point, the importance of organic relationships. When we started out together 8 years ago, this was never on our mind. It was never going to happen. It was never even a thought bubble. Now, standing here, it seems almost inevitable. But as we've heard from a lot of elders throughout this week, the main thing you can do is get out on country, go out for a yarn, go walk with elders, sit down, speak to them, take the time, invest the time, and you never know what's going to come out of it. My whole PhD now is going to be astrotourism focused, and focused on self-determination and best outputs for First Nations people. We've discussed what I'm doing with Jaja Wurrung. We've got similar projects running with a couple of other members of the Kulin Nation. Those ones are driven by what they want. It's all about self-determination and meeting Jaja Wurrung's aspirations as a support act, rather than us going in and saying, this is what I want to know, how can you help us?
Jaja Wurrung is very big on self-determination, and we always like to be leading the projects that we're actually involved with, more so than being invited to the table at the last minute. So thank you.
Do we have any questions online? Yes, two online.
Thanks.
What country do you consider applying to be?
This morning, when that presentation was on, we decided then, yes.
How do gender protect your intangible heritage stories about our skies, knowledge, and better our country? Have you considered the use of Original Heritage Act provisions on intangible heritage to add protected work? If so,
Go for it.
Yeah, we did mention that briefly in the presentation as well. We've decided we will attempt, well, with the elders' approval during the Wartica, we would like to attempt an intangible heritage registration. It's definitely in the works. It will be tested with the elders first. If they would rather that information didn't even go to First People State Relations, then it won't. It'll stay within the group, and only what JARA want to share will be shared.
Excellent. Take one more question.
Say you will be good because I'm from Taiwan and have a poster about something about Muslims. So in Taiwan we have not good process about research. So if everybody wants to know more.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Just to reflect, we are rerunning a reflection conflict with property rules right now. At a Commonwealth level, to translate to some of these sort of statements, because we recognise that the state level of stuff, like registration is good, at a Commonwealth level where intellectual property is protected or arguably contested, we're rewriting those rules right now. Kerri and I are on the Commonwealth board for that. Those laws should be in place by the year, which will strengthen the entire regime of Indigenous culture and intellectual property, all of these elements. That's just, I just want to make sure I said something positive.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, JARA have their own cultural integrity guidelines as well. So we've sort of strengthened that knowledge on top of, so that when JARA are doing something, we know that we're speaking, you know, with elders' rights, and yeah, everything that we do is because of them. So thank you.
but if you want to come and help us, give me a shout.
Yeah,
Excellent. Thank you so much.
thank you.
All right, I'd like to invite Dr. Anton Binneman to come up and talk about MeerKAT, the SKA, and Indigenous astronomy. Do you want this mic or this mic? Or both?
I'm going to use that.
All right. I'll leave this here.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to start with an acknowledgement, and then I have a few confessions. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge all the traditional leaders and the people represented here, because there's a lot of them from a lot of different cultures from all over the world. Then I want to start with confession. The first one is that most of us comes from some kind of indigenous grouping. My own indigenous people was a great people of the sea. People who were guided by the stars, who lived with the land, whose blood was part of the ground. Because of the sins of my forefathers, that bond with my ancestors was broken. So therefore, I stand in front of you as someone who understands that I speak with a limited understanding of a lot of the things that we're dealing with. The third one is that I'm not actually an astronomer, and I'm also not an archaeoastronomist. So I'm actually a trained therapist. So I did my PhD in narrative and family therapy. So which tells you something more. And the last one is that this is probably the last peer astronomy conference that I'll be attending, because I'm moving back into different kind of research. So with that, the story of the MeerKAT, SKA, and Indigenous astronomy. Early days when I joined the project, there was a lot of concern about Indigenous communities around where the instruments will be built, specifically in South Africa, and a lot of allegations that we're not taking local communities serious, while I was busy managing relationships in these local communities as the stakeholder for this project. So I started working on just showing and profiling the work that we're doing in these communities and that the SKA is doing. So if the question is, does the SKA care about Indigenous communities in South Africa? The answer is definitely yes. And we can talk about that. So the paper that I'm presenting now is published. I brought a few copies of the book that it's published, and it's a free publication spread in schools in South Africa. So that's done. So that's the next one. What did we try to do when I did this study? So the first thing is, as an introduction, is in South Africa, there's a lot of Indigenous astronomies. So there's no single Indigenous astronomy. There's a lot of them. The second point is, in terms of the paper specifically, the Bleak and Lloyd archives had to be used. The reason for this is the area where the SKA is being constructed, the Indigenous people were hunted to extinction in that area. So they were driven out. Some of them, in the end, became farm workers, and a lot of the knowledge was gone. So with that said, there has been a lot of papers published, published by John Parkington, Jose de Prada, Jarita, Neil Rush, David Morris. I can go on and on and on and on about how many papers have been published. Thus, the expectation would be that you would find a healthy, thriving Indigenous culture in this area, which is not the case, and I'll come to that now. So one of the first things we did is we developed this booklet. And there's a few free copies, so you're welcome to help yourselves afterwards. And this booklet, the process that we followed was to, and this is also, by the way, this is a free community booklet, and I'll explain the methodology behind this, that acknowledges the Indigenous ownership at the back in their pictures. So you're welcome to look at this. The methodology was that when I started in the project, our environmental impact assessments expected us to document the use of medicinal plants in the area. We didn't find any documented, or we couldn't find any experts within the field to help us. Therefore, we did an ethnobotanical study of the area based on the Bleak and Lloyd archives, which you're welcome to go and reference, to find out what is being done in terms of medicinal plants in the 4 or 5 villages surrounding the SKA site in the Karoo. And in a lot of cases, you guys will not be surprised, but there was a lot of evidence of Indigenous plant use in the area. So much so that 17 unique uses of plants in this specific area has been identified and documented and given back to these communities. Because that's going to be my big critique, is what do we do with these things? A lot of Western scientists comes to communities, they extract data, and they never go back to any of those communities. And this was an effort not to do that. It was an effort to, one, acknowledge Indigenous knowledge, and make sure that the knowledge that has been removed from the communities is taken back to these communities. So the medicinal plant study was one of the first ones. And then we started thinking about, what about the stories about astronomy? Because the Bleak and Lloyd archive has literally hundreds of different stories that was told in this area, according to the informants. And we encountered, or in my work over the last 10 years in these communities, we've encountered very little of these stories. And I do a lot of sky tours, and I've trained Indigenous astronomy astro guides, or we call them the Carnarvon astro guides. And the stories didn't come to the fore. So what happened to this? So we started a process where we looked at running workshops in the communities to get an understanding of where they are at and what material could and could not be used for this indigenous astrotourism process that we were looking at. And we ran it in the listed towns. It's Carnarvon, Williston, Van Wyksvlei, Brandvlei, Loxton, Swartkop, to try and determine which of these stories still exists in these communities. This is just a Bleak and Lloyd archive or a list of things that could be tested, but it goes on. There's literally about 150 stories documented that we looked at. During this process, we identified stories, but the main findings of this study was that despite the massive amount of academically published work, very little to nothing remains in these communities as described by Bleak and Lloyd's informants. And this is the reason why I started doing this, because these same publishers had a lot of critique on how I did my work in these communities. To such an extent that I started attending these kinds of conferences to go and to tell people, listen, we're doing the work, we're there, I'm in the community, I'm walking around, listening to stories, working with indigenous communities and indigenous people. So despite all the research, very little was happening in the communities because of the culture that exists amongst a lot of researchers. Not all of them, there's some that actually goes back to the communities, but most of these publishers never go back. And the stories, it's like mining to an extent, didn't go back. So what did we identify? In the stories that we looked at, 4 main types of stories was identified. The first was nature's rhythms and cycles. And I'll show you an example of the stories just now. Ghost and a spiritual dimension. A lot of us as Westerners, and I heard some of the frustrations of the traditional leaders in this conference, goes up to indigenous art or indigenous stories with a Western-based knowledge. A lot of times something spiritual happened in a specific place and people don't talk about it. And we're not allowed access to that because something significant happened there. So spiritual dimension is always something that is holy to an extent. Holy is probably, it's spiritually significant and not shared. So there was ghosts and a spiritual dimension, different versions of the story of the water serpent or the water snake, and objects that moves in the sky. So these were the main storylines that we could identify that still exists and is being used in the communities currently. Very little astronomy, very little of the Bleak and Lloyd archives. Stories that we found, and I'm going to give an example. In Brandvlei, one of the communities, a person told us a story about the moon and where the moon got its spots. It was a vulture that flew too high and too far and too fast. And this vulture flew into the moon, and where the vulture hit the moon, the feathers stuck. Which is not part of the Bleak and Lloyd archives. It's current living indigenous knowledge amongst these people. The moon in predicting rain, this is quite popular. I think Jarita made some videos about it that you can watch online. But the moon was used in cycles in understanding rain. Venus came up quite a bit, like discussed in this conference before. Sometimes Venus and Jupiter was switched around, but not an issue. It shows a cycle. In their words, it shows infiltrate, the starting time. And then the false dawn or the zodiac lighting and the water snake, the water serpent. Water, or where there's water, this narrative lives in a lot of South African culture and stories, and also in the Northern Cape. So the zodiacal light would be a place where the serpent put down a stone to attract its prey, and then it would either hunt in the form of a leopard or something like that, and usually hunting humans. So people like me with thick eyebrows, usually more prone to be catched because we're prettier, apparently. And the rest, people with thin eyebrows, it would take and it would kill them and it would spit them out again. So there's different versions of this story being told in that area. In Brandvlei, where there's no rivers, no water, the same story is told about caves and cave systems, because there's quite a bit of caves. And they have a creature called the Ogfoot or the Eyefoot. And this creature would typically attract people, catch them, kill them in the caves and spit them out. In terms of Indigenous use of these stories, there's a reason why it was done, and why it was used and still being used in the communities like it's done. So very little of the Bleak and Lloyd archives exists in these communities. So for instance, in the Bleak and Lloyd archives, Orion's belt will be 3 female tortoises on a string, and the sword will be 3 male tortoises on a string. I have 2 minutes left. So what is my recommendations? And this is, as someone walking away from this type of conferences, going into a new kind of job, is you have an ethical obligation, if you do research in these communities, to take your knowledge back. It needs to benefit communities. If you don't do it, there's a special kind of hell waiting for you. I'm serious, because as astronomers or as people doing research in these communities don't benefit off the work we're doing. And don't just give critique, because I've been the subject of a lot of critique, working really hard in these communities to make sure that Indigenous stories are being preserved and that Indigenous communities are being protected. So I understand it when traditional leaders get upset about the work that we're doing or don't want to share stories, because we're going to put it in an academic journal that no one will read, ever. And the communities who told the stories are none the wiser. So please, you have an obligation. The second one, Astrotourism development. The previous talk talked about that. Invest in it. Indigenous people have stories that they are allowed to tell, and it benefits communities. And then cultural events, especially in communities where there's a lot of youth. What I've noticed with my work is that if you start investing in Indigenous stories, people with Indigenous links picks up these stories and it gives them a sense of pride. So I've seen in the Carnarvon context, a lot of kids wants to be gangsters because that seems like the cool thing to do. As soon as you start telling them your culture is more than 5,000 years old, and these are the stories, they want to know about becoming a sand person again. So we've done, unlike the presentation of yesterday morning, we've done these presentations and implementations in the communities. I paid for it from my cost center. So make sure that you communicate this. What MeerKAT and SKA is doing, we're doing a lot of work. You're welcome to get free copies. There's a lot of things that we're doing in the communities as listed here. It will be on YouTube, so you're welcome to look at it. And this is just some photos that I took with my iPhone. The dark skies in the central Karoo is amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions? We time for one question.
Hi, Anton. It's nice to see you again after a year. So, just quick question. Is there any dog that the local people around the SKAO will object or hinder the development of the facility, because actually the facility is very expensive, very high-tech fancy, and then is there any doubt that the local people will maybe run it, not support it? Thank you. And if there is that kind of doubt, how do you deal with that in your position as relations manager? Thank you.
So up until the end of July, I can guarantee you that it's not going to happen. What and how the project is managed going forward and how the relations in communities are managed going forward will determine a lot of it. Because up until now, there has been no disruptions with the project. We fight. The community, like any other indigenous community, does object to certain things, and then we correct. But no, there's no imminent danger of the project being stopped.
Great. Thank you so much for the talk. Would you like to have these at a table out there where people can come grab them afterwards, or just leave them up here? Leave them here? Okay, this is great. It's great. No worries. Excellent. Okay.
Say everyone, I'm Tumo Kedumele, and I'm going to be presenting to you on the nexus between Indigenous people, their ancient knowledge of the night sky, and scientific astronomy projects, which is a study based on the Indigenous sun communities in Botswana and Namibia. So this study was facilitated in collaboration with Women in STEM Botswana, Namibia University of Science and Technology, Redbard University, Rhodes University, as well as the Office of Astronomy for Education based in Botswana. So just to look at the background, Botswana and Namibia are countries in Southern Africa that are known for their very low population density compared to other nations. So in both these countries, one can experience unpolluted night skies in most areas, and therefore we do not have a great issue of light pollution. So these countries are homes to ancient San people and their descendants, and these San people currently live a semi-modern life while also holding on to their ancient ways and knowledge of the southern night sky, which was passed down over centuries by their forefathers. So this indigenous knowledge was passed down as a part of their oral tradition, and it's still the case today. Unfortunately, very little of this knowledge has been documented to be shared with the younger generations. So our main objectives with this study was to investigate the cultural connection between the night sky and the sun culture, therefore highlighting the importance of indigenous astronomy in the sun communities in Botswana and Namibia. Was also to investigate the connection between indigenous astronomy of the sun and modern scientific astronomy through knowledge matching and support, to also promote indigenous astronomy as a tool for income generation, cultural appreciation, inclusion, and also contribute to sustainable development for the San communities in these rural areas. It was also to contribute towards the documentation of indigenous astronomy of the San communities in both Botswana and Namibia, and last but not least, to promote the inclusion of San indigenous astronomy knowledge in basic and higher learning institutions. So, with regards to the research findings in Botswana, we were looking at a San subgroup called the Tsila Tsua, which is based in the Central District, but they originally migrated from the Central Kalahari Desert region, where the Central Kalahari Game Reserve is located. So the migration from their forefathers' lands was a result of the CKGR land dispute with the Botswana government. So this migration led them to mix and settle with other ethnic groups such as the Bangwato and Bakwena, which are in the Central District, but specifically in a village called Sorowe, which is east of the CKGR, and this is where we facilitated the study. The San, they currently lead a semi-modern life and are still holding on to their ancient traditions of medicine making, hunting, and using indigenous astronomy to hunt and navigate their lands. So Here we have maps that are showing the location of the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, which is in map 1 in the blue circle. And also we have the small village, which I was talking about, where they currently inhabit or live right now, called Serowe. And on the other map, we have the sand distribution showing the Tsila and the Tua group who migrated from the CKGR region. So from our research findings from both Botswana and Namibia, some of the Tsila Tua San of Botswana and the Johansi San of Namibia, they continue to use their knowledge of the southern sky to guide their relationship with the earth and to positively influence their daily life. So they use this knowledge in weather predictions, particularly in rain forecasting, navigation, hunting, agriculture, social and political aspects, also to determine time and season, and also for spiritual understanding. So within the Tsila Tua interpretation of the sun, we have come to understand that to them, the sun was seen as a sign of success or poverty, and they believed that the higher the heat intensity of the sun, the more poverty it indicated. And the sun halo was a significant call for them, which signaled a community call to the royal house to discuss the plowing season. So the sun halo was and is still believed to be an indicator of rainfall, hence a sign of abundant harvest or agricultural success. The moon and the halo, which they called Mwedi, was often linked to the feminine energy or was a feminine symbol to them. So they used the lunar cycles to build community calendars and also to track women's menstrual cycle. The moon halo was seen as an indicator of good rainfall season and a successful harvest. So this phenomenon signaled a community call called Pizo, which was also similar to the sun halo. It's a community call to the royal house to discuss the plowing season. With its appearance, preparations for plowing and planting began. The moon halo still appears annually in September, which is the season still used to prepare for the plowing season nationally. So their interpretation of the Pleiades was that they called it Silimela, which means the rain stars. It was seen as a significant rainfall predictor. The brighter and clearer it was observed, the more rainfall it indicated. It appeared in spring and was often observed as brighter in October, just after the moon halo. If both the Pleiades and the moon halo were observed to be much brighter, it indicated an even more successful rainfall season, thus urging the community to prepare for the plowing season. But if the Pleiades was dimmer, just after observing the moon halo, then the community expected little rainfall. Therefore, this indicated low to moderate success during the harvest season. Their interpretation and understanding of Venus was that it's a star. It's a brilliant celestial source in the evening and in the morning. So as the evening star, it signified the beginning of the night and was called Kopadilalelo, which means the one who asks for the evening meal. And it was a sign of communal relations or sharing evening meals within the community. As the morning star, it signified the break of dawn and was called Nalediamasa or Tagamuso or Ntuna or Mpatlalatsani. So as Mpatlalatsani, it was believed to be the one who sends off and scatters the darkness or the night. As Tagamuso or Nalediamasa, it was believed to be the one who ushers in the sun, light, or the new day. It was called Ntuna Ketsamaye, which means kiss me goodbye, to signify the love relationship of a couple. To them, Mercury was not given any name, but it was referred to as a companion to the evening star, since it was sometimes seen as a very faint star next to Venus. So the interpretation of Orion was that they called it Dinjali Dikolobe, which means the dogs and pigs. The stars of Orion's sword were seen as Dinja or the dogs and the belt as Dikolobe or the pigs. And this interpretation of the constellation is the three dogs chasing the three pigs. They indicated that they saw it during the summer season and that it had no significant link to agriculture or weather-focused predictions like the other celestial sources. They also indicated that they could identify the Southern Cross and they called it Ditutla, which means giraffes. They observed it in the south direction during the winter season. They identified it as a very large star, as they identified it as 4 very large stars connecting with the other 2 stars above them, thus forming a giraffe shaped. They believed that the 2 brighter stars in the Southern Cross were masculine symbols and the other 2 less bright stars were feminine symbols. They believed that the brighter the Southern Cross appeared, then it indicated that there will be poor vegetation for the livestock and poverty for the community. So the Tsilatswa interpretation of Canopus, the large Magellanic Clouds and the small Magellanic Cloud is such that the Canopus to them was called Naga or Naledi ya Mariga. They called it Naga, which indicated that it was the winter horn, or Naledi ya Mariga, which translates to the winter star. So essentially, it was a signal to the arrival of winter. They often saw it during winter in the southeast direction. They observed it as a brighter star unaccompanied by other bright stars. They believed that the brighter it was, the more severe the winter would be. Therefore, this raised concern for their livestock welfare and agricultural produce. The SMC and LMC were called Mahakala, which translates to a cluster of stars. They indicated to see them in the southward direction. They believed that the brighter the Magellanic Clouds appeared, the greater the poverty. The LMC, however, was seen as a sign of great poverty and was called Tala or Tala, meaning lack. And the SMC was seen as a sign of good harvest, and therefore it was called Koro, meaning abundance. With regards to shooting stars, they named them Sibaladinaledi, which means the star counter. They did not believe them to have any great significance to their daily lives, but to count the stars. Although some groups within the San group community believed them to be indicators of a bad omen for the royal house or community leadership, they believed them to be a sign of sickness or death in the royal house. And then their understanding and interpretation of the Milky Way was that they called it Lesaharipana Ladinaledi, which means where the stars are clustered, or Malalatladi, which means where the lightning rests. Some believed it to be a path for their ancestors, while others believed it was simply a guiding path for the stars at night and the sun during the day. Now, looking at the research findings with the Namibia, we were focusing on the Johansi sand subgroup, which is located in the Tsumkwe settlement in the northeastern part of Namibia in the Kalahari Desert. This settlement is found within the Nyanyai Conservancy, and they still continue to live a semi-traditional life there, still preserving their indigenous knowledge of astronomy. Here is a map showing the Nyanyai Conservancy and the Tsumkwe settlement where the Nyanyai people, where the Johansi people are found. And then the other side is a sand distribution map showing the Johansi sand subgroup in Namibia and in Botswana. So the Johansi used star knowledge for navigation and hunting. They used the phases of the moon to guide them during hunting. So they believed that whenever the moon was facing the southward direction, it was a bad luck for hunting season. And when the moon was lying straight, which means it was at its highest peak in the sky, it was a good luck or a good signal for hunting, because therefore the night will be much brighter and they'll be able to track the animals and be able to kill them. But whenever the moon was lying in the opposite direction, which is the north side, it also indicated a bad sign, because it meant that there wouldn't be enough brightness for the animals to come out or for them to be able to track them. The Johansi also indicated to use the stars, particularly the evening star or morning star, which is Venus, for navigation. One gentleman within the community narrated a story talking about how navigation was used in their community, that in the morning when they're leaving their homes to go to the field in the eastward direction, there'll be the star that will be facing their chest, which essentially meant the morning star. And if they turned around to look back into the direction of home, then it would be at their back. So therefore, being able to use that sort of information was a good navigation skill for them. So from both findings, we understood, or we managed to gather, that both ethnic groups do not use this knowledge as much today, although they still continue to pass the stories and the knowledge to the younger generations. They further indicated that the knowledge is currently and mostly used by spiritual healers in the community for the benefit of all in their communities. We moved on to the knowledge matching part because we wanted to understand or gather if they have any understanding of scientific astronomy. And these communities indicated a very basic awareness of scientific astronomy and space technology through recognition and identification of certain constellations such as the Orion, and being able to identify satellite movements in the sky and differentiate them from celestial sources such as shooting stars. Although they indicated to have a lack of knowledge regarding modern astronomy projects such as telescopes and how to use them, the Square Kilometer Array project in Botswana, and the African Millimeter Telescope in Namibia. Therefore, this urges the need to raise awareness about modern scientific astronomy to the general public and especially to the indigenous people in both these countries. Continuing with scientific astronomy projects, we know that they have the potential and the capacity to support indigenous astronomy growth in Botswana and Namibia. And so far, DARA, which is the Development in Africa with Radio Astronomy, and the Office of Astronomy for Development, has frequently supported women in STEM to facilitate the AstroCamp project, which focused on a research study titled Indigenous Astronomy of the San People in Central Botswana, as well as this current study that I'm presenting. The AMT is currently supporting Indigenous astronomy through incorporating it in its planetarium project, which brings knowledge to children across Namibia. And then the SKA Avian Office of Botswana is currently contributing towards Astrotourism development through astronomy observation trainings, which also includes Indigenous astronomy in Botswana. In conclusion, we can say that responsible astrotourism is one tool that can be used to prevent the decline of the richness of Indigenous astronomy knowledge through the continuous use of the original transmission of Indigenous astronomy, such as storytelling, songs, dance, arts, and crafts that can be incorporated in astrotourism activities and programs. Responsible astrotourism can also be used to foster capacity building and socioeconomic development and empowerment programs in these same communities through astrotourism programs that are beneficial to the youth. We also realized that we can use education, development, and documentation to preserve the indigenous knowledge of astronomy through documentation, such as research articles and books that can be distributed to secondary schools. We can also learn to use Indigenous astronomy methods as a guiding tool for scientific astronomical observations. For example, the lunar cycle calendar and the general calendars that they have from astronomy. We can also promote inclusion of Indigenous astronomy as a module in astronomy or science curricula at basic and higher education levels. And last but not least, we can promote Indigenous astronomy awareness through its inclusion in scientific astronomy projects and outreach to ensure that it remains relevant in the new space age. These are references, and thank you very much for your time.